Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on streamlining federal compliance. Today, we have a pretty interesting panel lined up for you. I'll start by introducing myself. I am Pitar Beselev. I'm an EVP at A-LIGN, and I oversee our public sector practice, among other things. I'll be moderating this panel today, and I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves. Jake, if you'd like to start.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about the wonderful world of federal compliance. I'm Jake Nix, founder and CEO of RiskPoint. We are an advisory-focused 3PAO, along with other commercial compliance aspects in the cybersecurity world, but looking forward to having a great conversation today about federal compliance. Kevin, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Jake. Kevin Donahue with the AWS Global Security Compliance Acceleration Team. I've been with AWS for about 5 years. Started out managing our FedRAMP authorization, and currently our team works with partners like A-LIGN and RiskPoint to help customers overcome security and compliance barriers. Scott?
All right, my name is Scott McDaniel. I am CEO of Simple Helix. So we are a managed service provider that also owns and operates our own data center that is dedicated towards the DoD defense contracting world. And so we at Simple Helix, we've been following federal compliance now since 2018. And have helped numerous gov contractors prepare for standards like NIST 800-171 and CMMC. And then we continue to evolve as this whole world continues to change. And so we kind of roll with the punches as well. And it takes a lot to keep up with it. So excited to share what we've learned along our journey with federal compliance.
Great. Well, thanks, gentlemen. Certainly appreciate the introductions, and I'm pretty excited for the conversation today. Without any further ado, let's start with a few pretty basic things. As most of our audience knows, federal compliance and authorization can be a pretty complicated and intense process. Without having someone familiar with the documentation requirements, specific control requirements, whether you're looking at FedRAMP, CMMC, DISA, et cetera, and the overall process, we as 3PAO have seen companies spend more time and more money redoing the work internally over and over, where a qualified consultant would have been able to achieve those objectives much more quickly. As you know, as a 3PAO and a C3PAO, we're also limited to assessing the environment as it is currently in place. So clearly it's important to have someone who knows what needs to be implemented so that that process can be a lot more streamlined. Jake, let's start with a question for you. Being an advisor, working with some of those organizations, what are some things that you're seeing with clients, and what are some of the current challenges that organizations experience when they're getting ready for one of those authorization assessments?
I think the biggest challenge that customers have is a challenge that we all have in the community as well, which is there is a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that remains, especially in the CMMC space. And so when we look across the entire portfolio of federal compliance, there's a lot of easy ways to be confused, right? So if a customer starts down a path, they could be targeting the wrong compliance standards from the start. If you're not actively in the day in and day out of working with the EIB, with the CAC, with the FedRAMP PMO, there is a high likelihood that you don't understand the compliance measures and the program that you need to adhere to, primarily because it's changed a lot. FedRAMP itself is going through a critical revolution of standards. If you look at CMMC, it started with a completely different structure than 1.0. It's still not even active in law, and it's already talking about undergoing another spin cycle that's going to make it even more confusing. And so one of the things that we see of customers that are successful in the compliance journey is they start with strategy and they start with understanding okay, we need to get with an expert that is active in the community. And to your point, you're assessing 3PAO is a great place to start, but the assessor has to remain independent. And so getting in touch with an advisory 3PAO, and highly recommend only working with 3PAO advisors, if it is in the FedRAMP community, because the others that are tangential but don't maintain the status, they just don't have the same level of expertise and rigor. And they're likely a couple months behind on this changing environment. But we are here to help make sure that you do it against the right goalpost and you do it with the right strategy to make it sustainable and efficient. So that is what I'm seeing are honestly the ones that put the work and the investment in the strategy end up with like substantially lower cost of compliance over time.
Yeah, that's great points, Jake. And Scott, maybe a question for you. Jake mentioned some of the challenges of getting to a compliant state. We know that this can be pretty difficult and clearly important, but maintaining compliance is also key. How do organizations leverage managed service providers like yourselves to help with that task?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so to build on Jacob's point, we at Simple Helix, we often see businesses come to us. They think that going down the compliance journey would be like doing a running sprint race, right? They think, oh, I just come in, I just do this project this one time. I get to the end of it. Hey, there's all this documentation. It gets put in a 3-ring binder or a set of documentation. I can put it on the shelf. I don't ever have to look at it again. And the reality of it is that once you start, this thing never stops. There's stuff that you constantly have to do every single day. There's all this maintenance that goes with it. Just like, when you buy a car, it's not just the purchase of the car, right? There's oil changes and there's tires and you got to wash the car and all that stuff. This needs to be treated in that same way. And so just, kind of building on that car analogy, maybe you don't do the oil change yourself. You don't do the tires yourself. You take that to a shop, right? You can take your car back to a dealer. You can take it to, the Jiffy Lubes and those type of places. And that's where we as a managed service provider step in, is to be that resource available. And so we will use, our expertise, to kind of speak and again, build on Jacob's point. We're in this every day. There's a lot of knowledge that we build. There are things that, we continuously learn ourselves. And so you get to leverage our expertise in this space to help maintain and keep the IT environment in compliance, not just to do the technical uplift to get it to that place, but then, you leverage us to help maintain it and keep it in that state going forward.
No, thank you, Scott. This is again great advice and great feedback. Now, along those lines, we've all heard about some of the platforms and different accelerators. We know that those can be a huge efficiency boost for an organization that's looking to achieve that federal compliance. Many times, the starting point is most beneficial when a company is building out their environment from the ground up. This way, they can attach their product to a technology stack that's already built for FedRAMP compliance, or incorporate into the environment to quickly layer in the secure, the required security controls. Clearly, this can depend on the product, the current internal team expertise, engineering, and where you're in the development architecture. Now, along those lines, Kevin, a question for you. Working at AWS, what's your experience getting organizations ready for those compliance audits, and what have you seen with the, say, transition from an on-prem solution to something hosted by you guys?
Thanks, Batari. I think Jake really keyed in on a term that I feel is the theme for success here, which is strategy. These are strategic decisions to go and pursue a FedRAMP or a CMMC certification for the reasons that were discussed as well as that it's not just a simple documentation exercise or a one-time audit. These are investments that you're going to make as a business for the long term. So to do it thoughtfully, and especially in migrating from on-prem to the cloud, certainly recommend having a 3PAO advisor if that is what the end goal is to pursue one of these certifications, to just make sure that you're onboarding and transitioning applications onto FedRAMP authorized services, whether it's GovCloud or US East-West Commercial on AWS or elsewhere. You want to have in-house or advisory expertise to make sure that you're doing it right from the start. So to the point, there are platforms out there. AWS also offers products like Landing Zone Accelerator and other solutions that can help raise the compliance out of the box, so to speak, from the start, as well as all of our documentation and FedRAMP customer responsibility matrix that will tell you what your fully inheritable controls are. But we, it's a lot to figure out and navigate. And I would also say that scope really matters, and having advisory and 3PAOs with the expertise of what services are and how they apply to controls that are not written for the cloud necessarily is super important. And if you don't have that expertise, it can really leave you in a state of confusion and ultimately increased costs and time.
No, thank you, Kevin. And again, speaking of advisors, 3PAO scoping, Jake, maybe a follow-up question based on what Kevin said. What are you seeing in this context when working with companies that are trying to get ready for one of those authorization assessments?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting when we think about an organization that's migrating to the cloud. I think one of the reasons that we are very heavily bought into AWS is because of the enablement that they have for shared responsibility, right? If you look at the other hyperscalers, they don't give you nearly the level of clear documentation. And I say this as a genuine fan of what Kevin and his team have done with the CCGs. You're not having to guess when it comes to the way that you meet these authorizations when you're on AWS, because every single service has every control that is shared, very clearly delineated what you are responsible for and how you need to configure your services to become compliant with FedRAMP. So I think this comes back to the first point that I made, which is if you are not stopping and performing strategy assessments with somebody that's been through it previously, that can bring these lessons learned and look at your business and say, if we're going to do this hyperscaler makes sense. This is the way that we should do it. This is the security stack that we should utilize. We should call someone like Scott. We should get these things in place. You're going to find yourself with a almost unmanageable level of compliance debt. We talk about tech debt all the time, and it's a very well-known area of issue in the cloud world and the programming world. But compliance debt is crippling to some organizations because they start picking off frameworks one at a time. Everything becomes disparate, and we don't have a streamlined way to manage the enterprise compliance demands. For me, the biggest thing for success for anyone looking to get FedRAMP authorized, CMMC compliant, state ramp authorized, SOC 2 even, is engage in an assessment of what your long-term needs are and ensure that you're being strategic in the way you implement these programs.
No, that was great. Thank you, Jake. Now, switching gears for a second, clearly, no bias on my end, but I have to ask this question. As we know, picking the right 3PAO or say C3PAO on the CMMC side can have an impact on the overall cost and ultimately the timeline of any authorization or certification. We've heard many times that the right assessor will be ultimately able to quickly identify some of those immediate showstopper items, common among organizations looking for authorization or certification way before getting into the meat of the assessment, which ultimately should lead to cost and efficiency savings. But again, Jake, since we had you on the line, as an advisor, I'm assuming you work with many assessors. What should organizations pursuing an assessment look for in an assessor, and maybe what are some of the red flags that you see?
My biggest red flag when working with assessors are those that overstep the bounds of independence. That is number one. It is not worth the risk of potentially losing your authorization, potentially not getting through the process by working with someone that is not clear in their independence. That aside, because there's not a ton of assessors in the marketplace that do not clearly abide by that, is experience. You want an assessor that is, whether as an organization has a fair number of assessments conducted, or via personnel has in-depth experience with the PMO, with DIBCAC, with the DoD, with C3PIOs, under joint surveillance programs. You do not want to be working with the low-cost provider that is looking for their first assessment. It is not a game of try hard enough. It is a game of expertise, experience, and that is something that you need to ensure your 3PAO has, because especially in FedRAMP, things can change before they're publicized. So when we looked at the REV4 to REV5 transition, REV4 assessments were starting to have REV5 concepts applied at the PMO debrief. And so this is an area where working with good assessors, and we're very fortunate. We work closely with A-LIGN. We work closely with the majority of the top 3PAOs. We had several organizations reach out to us and say, hey, the PMO is looking at things a little bit differently, because their job is to take authoritative information and protect the United States government and our federal assets, right? We are silly to think that when the PMO changes their standards and they look at things with a better informed view, that it is anything but patriotic. It is one of the best things that this country does in terms of the next generation warfare, is to protect federal data. And so what you need to ensure is your assessor is getting that information, sharing it with your advisor, and that we're doing the right things to protect the U.S. federal data. Or in an even more extreme circumstance, in CMMC, DIBCAC data, or I'm sorry, DIB data. At the end of the day, we want to protect this data as citizens. We want to make sure that this is going to be protected the right way. And so working with organizations that understand the importance of that and are not looking to give you a discount check the box compliance standard, those are the ones you need to work with.
Thanks, Jake. And just to piggyback off of what you said, Scott, I know you've gone through some assessments yourself, and you've worked with a lot of organizations that do those as kind of the managed security advisor. Anything to add? What have you seen? Anything different than what Jake mentioned?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. First of all, everything that Jacob said, absolutely spot on. Super great advice there. Places where I build on top of that is what we've seen through some of the JSVAs is that, there absolutely has been real life examples where assessors have latched on to the quote next version coming and are trying to apply it to the environment as it is today. And so, just like, Jacob was saying, hey, we're talking about FedRAMP version 5. Hey, but if we're doing a FedRAMP version 4, we got to stay on bounds on what 4 says. We can't, I understand that you learned it, you're seeing what's coming, but hey, we're still doing doing the 4. We've seen the same thing with other folks going through like a PCI assessment. If we're doing 3.2, hey, you can't lump the 4.0 stuff into your 3.2 compliant or audit. A couple other things that we see happen with our customers is that business owners think that they can just fully hand over all of this compliance work to the folks like us on this panel today. And when we've gotten into the audits, the auditors won't talk to me as the MSP. They're not going to talk to Kevin at AWS. They're going to want to talk to people within that business to answer their questions during the audit phase. And so we spend a lot of time at Simple Helix, educating our customers like, hey, when it comes to the audit, you're going to be engaged. You have to know some of this stuff. And, you need to be prepared, to speak to certain points, and you can't just let all of that work fall on your service providers and everything like that. And so with that, it means that the business is going to be spending time with the assessors, with the auditors, and you need to make the investment in looking at your auditors because you're going to have a really long lasting relationship. And so, we have relationships with our auditors and, they have learned our environment. There are things that we don't have to go and do every year because we keep coming back to the same auditors, and there's tribal knowledge that gets built, there's relationships that get built. It makes the experience go better for everybody. And so that all needs to be incorporated in your decision-making process as you go through the assessments. The last thing I'll touch on some other things that we have seen get through the audits, which is that not necessarily every single auditor is always 100% correct, right? That when you're working with a particular controls are subjective. You may have to work through, what that definition and work through the subjectiveness of it. But, auditors are not necessarily always 100% correct. There should be an avenue to have a conversation, to talk through the topic. If a correction needs to be made, that's okay. But we have, I'll share just one quick example. We were working through an audit. We had an auditor come back and tell the customer they can't use a piece of software because the piece of software was not in the FedRAMP marketplace. And we were doing NIST 800-171, and the word FedRAMP doesn't even exist in the NIST 800-171 standard. And so we were like, hey, where do you get this from? And it turned out the piece of software wasn't even a cloud product. It was an application that gets installed on a PC. And so the auditor was not 100% correct, but we had to work through that. And I will say in that particular case, the customer was under the mindset that the auditor was always correct. And like, you can't argue it. You can't. So we're going to have to pivot. We can't use that piece of software anymore. And it was a moment of, hold on, we got to talk through that and make sure that we're actually doing the right thing. But those are just some examples that happen in the middle of an audit. And so if you pick the right people, you don't have to deal with those type of problems.
Thanks, Scott.
Can I jump right here just as an anecdote? How many times do you think you and I have gone on call because our teams disagree? And both teams were rooted in factual, correct thought. And it's just fine. This is the part that I think the majority of those outside of the industry miss, is the fact that, especially in a NIST assessment, there is a lot of professional judgment, and it takes good, confident people coming together in a civil manner to discuss it. And that is another reason to use an experienced assessment firm, because the last thing you want is an auditor that's inexperienced that thinks, no, I am right because I'm the auditor. I say this as a former reformed auditor. There's a lot of times where I was wrong in my audit days, let me tell you. And I had factual, methodology backing me up. But at the end of the day, there are always more than one way to look at something, especially in
Sure, exactly.
No, appreciate the chime in, Jake. And if I ever need to have a conversation with an IRS auditor, I'll make sure you're on my side, because I I don't know if those guys are as reasonable as we tend to be during those NIST-based assessments. So, but all joking set aside, one question that comes up very often is a lot of organizations that we work with have gone through other, say, commercial assessments, say a SOC 2 and ISO 27001. And, one of the things that pops up all the time is, existing documentation like policies and procedures, security plans being utilized as a starting point. We say, although those can meet some requirements, usually they need updates to ensure completeness of the controls covered by the framework for, your desired compliance outcome. Clearly, working with an advisor, that existing documentation tends to help jumpstart some of those conversations, and, bringing the advisor up to speed on the environment quickly. But maybe, again, Kevin, starting with you, kind of the curveball, what are you seeing? Organizations transitioning from a commercial assessment, SOC 2, ISO 27001, PCI, to one of the NIST-based assessments like FedRAMP, StateRAMP, CMMC. Clearly, that can be challenging. What advice do you have for some of those organizations that plan to go through that?
Yeah, transition the opposite way, if possible. And what I mean by that is NIST is very, very comprehensive. It's a lot easier to go from NIST and then map across the other standards. But it's not impossible. So if you're transitioning from commercial based certifications into NIST, chances are it's a good investment, whether you're pursuing FedRAMP, CMMC, or you just want to hit the high bar. Your security posture is going to be better over time. Going from that documentation in the commercial based assessments to NIST, you'll probably end up with, if you do it the right way, better policies and procedures and overall better security hygiene. You'll also probably position yourself to be able to pursue other commercial based assessments more easily, or audit certifications, more easily if you try to, work backwards from that NIST high bar.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Kevin, and I wish organizations had that luxury every time. A lot of them do. A lot of them use NIST-based standards from what we've seen as a starting point, but some do start with others. Scott, maybe a kind of a follow-up question for you. What are you seeing along the same lines? If you're going through a SOC 2 Type 2 assessment, FedRAMP comes up on the horizon, maybe StateRAMP, maybe CMMC. What are you seeing as some of the success factors in being able to kind of migrate, I'd say, in an efficient manner?
Yeah, so we at Simple Helix, today we do SOC 2, we do PCI. Obviously, we're getting ready to do CMMC or CMMC version 2.0 when it finally becomes real. And so one of the biggest success stories for us is that as we started our very first compliance program, instead of just taking the first framework and writing all our documentation specifically to it, we had enough foresight to know that we would eventually be under multiple frameworks at the same time. And so we made sure that we created our policies and procedures as corporate policies and procedures. Then we take those corporate policies and procedures and we map them to the multiple standards that we're having to work with. And then here more recently, we ended up leveraging a GRC tool to help us now manage these multiple frameworks. But it was very easy for us to get into the GRC tool because we had already created our policies and procedures in such a way that it was easy to plug it in. But one of the things that we see with a lot of our customers is they're hyper-focused on the framework that's in front of them right here, right now. And we take a lot of time to help them educate. And it's like, okay, well, I understand. You got to, somebody just told you to do NIST 800-171. The reality of it is that you also have a commercial arm of the business. So you're probably going to get asked to do an ISO, or, if they came up with a medical product, you're going to end up in that SOC 2, HIPAA, and all that stuff. So you need to be ready for multiple frameworks, and here's some strategies to get you ready for that. And for us, the big one was make your policies and procedures as corporate policies and procedures so that you can map a policy or a procedure to multiple frameworks. And that way you don't end up with just documentation on top of documentation. And then you change something and then you forget, oh, we updated it in 2 of the 3 standards and we forgot to do the 3rd one, and that gets you in trouble. This makes it much easier to manage for the long haul.
No, thank you. Thank you, Scott. That's definitely great feedback. Now, speaking of policies, procedures, just in general, the process, quality comes up often. We say that it's something that not only enables an organization to meet their compliance requirements as part of their authorization or audit or certification, but those are key for organizations that are looking to achieve a strong security posture, which ultimately provides immeasurable value in their current environment when it comes to defending against cyber attacks, data leakage, all those kind of negative events that may occur. Kevin, a follow-up question for you. How can someone like AWS help ensure that quality controls environment for organizations that are seeking that authorization audit?
So I'm going to pull a little thread that Scott was just alluding to with the corporate policies and procedures. I think it's super important to definitely have a high watermark to base those on. I will also say just a word of caution that you should probably think about separating out your authorization environment, for example, FedRAMP and CMMC, from your corporate environment from a documentation standpoint. So you could base your policies and procedures for whatever systems are in scope for that certification, but clearly delineate that they are completely separate from, for example, your corporate email servers. You don't want to confuse auditors with that kind of scope creep. From the AWS standpoint, Jake also touched on this earlier. Our end customers that are starting to develop out their security controls and their documentation, their policies and procedures, AWS provides excellent resources that go to the levels that are necessary to perform and execute audits. So from working backwards from our certification documentation that's on AWS Artifact with the audit reports. Most of those reports contain documents like the FedRAMP customer responsibility matrix for different compliance frameworks. But then we went a step further and created, we would get questions all the time from customers. All right, this customer responsibility matrix is great, but what are my responsibilities specifically for EC2 or Lambda or RDS? So we took it a step further and created customer compliance guides that map to 20 different compliance frameworks, because we thought, well, our security, the security of our services that our customers are responsible for is just basic and good hygiene best practices. Whether it applies to a given compliance framework or a given control or not, our customers should be doing this. So the guidance doesn't really change. You want to lock down your services to the most secure manner possible, so that you are not affected by any events. But then working backwards from our best practice security guidance among 140 now different services that are included in customer compliance guides, we're able to map those to related controls across those 20 different compliance frameworks. So awesome resource, great resource to get your documentation program started, and also an awesome resource to bring with you to audits to kind of discuss with your auditors what evidence you'll be able to be providing or will be required to provide.
No, thanks, Kevin. And Jake, anything to add from the perspective of an advisor who also supports audit? Again, focus on quality, how you can get organizations ready for those assessments in a more efficient fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll cover 2 pieces here. Qatar, just kind of going back to a previous conversation when you're talking about ISO, SOC, FedRAMP, right? Look, thing to keep in mind is SOC 2 and ISO and HIPAA and high trust and all of these commercial compliance frameworks are measures of your program for cybersecurity. And it's really intended to give your reader or your user the ability to understand the way that you have deployed cybersecurity compliance controls. FedRAMP, StateRAMP, CMMC is the US government's ability to measure your cybersecurity maturity, your cybersecurity adherence consistently. And so when you think about SOC 2 and ISO, the reason that those have that level of flexibility is because as the organization, you're providing this trust report to your entity user, right? And so there's a lot more flexibility in those because ultimately what you need to do is be technically right in the way that you deploy your cybersecurity. In FedRAMP, StateRAMP, CMMC, there's right and there's wrong and there's federally compliant. And the reason that that matters is because there are ways to do things outside of the state 153 that are just as good and potentially in some cases better. But the government entities that regulate you cannot measure you when you deviate. And so the biggest thing that I would say, in addition to Kevin's point about, you can start with NIST and come down, is there's a reason for that. And if you deviate where you have the ability to deviate, it makes it much easier because then you're keeping that gold standard at your baseline that'll cover you against that stringent measurement. And then you can go forward from there. That's one of the reasons when we perform advisory services, especially around, policies and procedures, we don't use a tool that magically makes an SSP done in 45 minutes, right? We don't shortcut this because you need to strategically think through each implementation, each control family. What is it that I need to do? And when you're looking for a partner in this, you need to look for a partner that does not just have the ability to create documentation, but has the ability to advise on control implementation and validate that controls are correct, and then defend that when you're undergoing an audit or assessment.
Well, thanks, Jake. And, that kind of leads to something, a quick question for you, Scott. Assessments tend to be a point of time, kind of evaluation of where an environment sits. Clearly, there's some continuous monitoring activities that are expected of CSPs to perform. Again, being a managed security provider, you work with a lot of organizations that have gone through compliance assessments, and I'm assuming a lot of organizations that haven't. Just out of curiosity, do you see a better ongoing security posture of those that have gone through a compliance assessment compared to their peers that have not done that and maintained that?
Oh, absolutely. And so I will say one of the typical themes that we see is that, especially on the federal side of the house, is that initially, if we have a customer that starts on this journey and they kind of come in with it of, well, this is Big Brother, and they're just causing me to have additional costs. They're making me pay to do all this stuff. They have a very negative connotation towards it. Then as they go through and get down the journey, they see where, hey, all of a sudden, there are stability coming into their entire IT environment that they haven't seen before, right? Maybe they didn't fully appreciate what, an individual's laptop not working correctly or a firewall not working correctly, but just in the spirit of trying to meet the compliance requirements, the overall security goes up, the overall quality of their IT environment goes up. And as a result, they eventually start seeing they have fewer problems. And then all of a sudden that negative connotation that they started with starts to transform into a more positive experience. And so we start to get acceleration in the capabilities that we get to do and the abilities to go make things better. And I think it really does educate that business owner or that C-suite, that there really is true value in this. And unfortunately, as we try to engage with folks, we have to get them over that barrier. But for those that have actually gone down the journey, have actually done this stuff, I mean, and then just me as a service provider, I see it, and I'll come back and I'll show the statistics where there's just fewer trouble tickets, right? There's just fewer things that break in their day-to-day operations, and there's therefore a nice benefit that comes out of it. So, there's definitely a true benefit that happens outside of, hey, Big Brother told me I had to do this.
No, thank you, Scott. And this again, this is certainly very relevant to this conversation. And again, I appreciate your insight here. Now, one of the things that again we certainly want to make sure we touch on today, and for the sake of time, I'll open this up to everyone. We keep hearing about some of the changes that are coming up, especially in this case in the federal public sector landscape. So CMMC being a new standard, OSCAL, the AIRMF, and just in general automation. Kevin, maybe start with you. What are you all seeing and hearing? What are organizations doing to prepare, and ultimately, what should they be doing these days?
Yeah, good question. So as it relates to OSCAL, I think in my opinion, the technology isn't quite there yet. From what we've been hearing, FedRAMP and DoD and others are kind of waiting for the technology to become more ubiquitous before it is like a strict mandate. So if I'm an organization that's adhering to FedRAMP or CMMC, it's on my radar, but I'm not putting a ton of resources into it right now. As far as CMMC goes, it's a little bit murky, I think, at the moment in terms of who is going to be enforced and when, based on the rolling enforcement beginning next year. So just being prepared, double checking all of our documentation, our security controls, just being audit ready at all times is probably the best approach for those.
No, thanks, Kevin. And Jake, I'll turn that over to you again. Any advice on what you're seeing, what's coming out in the federal space, again, as it pertains to security and compliance?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway that I would have is CMMC is real, FedRAMP is law, and this is all complex, right? So make sure that you reach out, you speak with someone active in the industry, because look, we're here as extensions of the US government to help, right? Especially RiskPoint as an advisory 3PAO, we genuinely enjoy building relationships and helping you better understand these complex areas, because it's better for all of us when that happens. And so that's one of the things that we're huge proponents of is let's get everyone educated. I'll give a really quick anecdote and then turn it back to you. We had a customer who is a software provider that works in CMMC that's been getting requests to be first 171 compliant and then CMMC level 2 certified. And then they came to us and they finally realized, well, for my services, I need to be CMMC level 2. For the software that I'm providing, I need to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And everything that touches that system boundary needs to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And so it's a very complex topic that you need a good partner in. And one of the things that we like to provide to the community is that partnership outside of the SOW. So again, reach out to us, let us help. We want you to be successful in this. And Pitar, thank you for putting this on and having us on.
Absolutely, Jake. And again, Scott, certainly, if you want to close us out, the same question about some of those changes that are coming up in the kind of the compliance, security in general, in the landscape, automation, AI, some of the new, compliance standards that are coming about. What are you seeing? What are some of the challenges? What's some of the advice that you can give some of those organizations?
Yeah, so when it comes to, AI and, embracing some of the new technologies, certainly they help with getting through the process. I would caution people to say, hey, it's a great tool. It certainly makes things more efficient and makes things easier, but not a full replacement for still walking down the entire journey. And so, because AI is not always perfect in itself either. These compliance programs, they are custom. They need to be specific to your business. And so, again, while they're great tools, they certainly help us out as MSPs. They help, do some of the more logistical work, but they don't replace the big portion that we've been spending a lot of time talking about today, which was around the strategy. So, we as the business owners and we as the partners that help that business owner, what we still have to help drive the strategy of it. And, but we still enjoy having the AI tools help us, configure things in a certain way, help us find root cause to outages and open ports and all those things a lot faster than we used to. So it does help accelerate the journey, just doesn't fully replace it.
Well, Scott, Kevin, Jake, I certainly appreciate your time today, gentlemen. I think this has been a very informative conversation and certainly appreciate your insights today. For those of you watching this, we'll be available for questions at the end of today's summit. So don't hesitate to submit anything that you want answered, and this group will get back to you. Enjoy the rest of today's sessions, and don't hesitate to reach out if any of us can be of help. Happy to make those introductions and connections. But again, thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll be in touch. Thanks.